Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com. Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 335th episode of Constructed Criticism. I'm your host Mason, and I'm joined by my co-host Allie. Allie, how you doing? We had a week off.
I'm doing a lot better now that I have a functioning computer, but...
Yeah, your computer kind of exploded, right? I didn't get all the details. Was it an old computer or just, what happened?
Yeah, I mean, it was Dylan's...
What happened?
Yeah, I mean, it was... Dylan's old desktop that he had let me use for the past couple months after he moved here, and I think it's just like the video card or something doesn't like to play video, so I couldn't have like my webcam working or my second monitor, and then the motherboard also was just done. So yeah, it was not having a good time.
So it's fair to say it's Dylan Hand's fault, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that seems like the appropriate response. Well, we had a week off. It was nice. We tried to get a guest host, but some things fell through. That's fine. Hopefully we can get them someday in the future. But for now, we've got a pretty interesting episode that, Allie, you kind of pitched to do. So I'm excited to talk about explored territory, things that we've already gone over. But first, Allie, we have to do always improving. What was your always improving moment in these last 2 weeks?
In time, kind of like burnt out on companions or burnt out on standard or a specific format or just Magic in general. And I think if you get to like that point, pushing yourself to keep playing Magic is just going to end up being harmful, like for your mental health, harmful for your actual gameplay, and like you're not going to actually improve. So taking some time to just like not play Magic can actually be a way how you improve, because you're not going to be improving if you're burnt out or frustrated with how things are lately. So just like, yeah, taking a step back at some point, so then you can like come back to the game refreshed and excited. I mean, like, I didn't have my computer, so like maybe that was
Yeah, I think that's like it's hard to practice and play Magic, especially nowadays, without a computer, right? Like, it's a good break. And I think what you said is so true, though, right? Like, if you're just ramming your head against the wall, it's not even, like, kind of fun. It's going to be a really miserable experience, and you're really going to get, like, close to nothing out of it. If anything, I think it actually, a lot of times what happens is people start to get burnt out, and they're like, no, I'm going to really commit to learning this standard for this GP this weekend. And they, like, run themselves in the ground, and they start, like, forming negative thoughts and stuff about the format that maybe aren't true, or about play patterns or decks and stuff, and they get, like, really sour on it because they don't like it, right? And they're like, the reason I don't like this is obviously this thing, So yeah. I always love taking some time off. My always improving moment this week was exploring some things that are out of my comfort zone again. So like, I normally, especially in Modern, I don't like to play reactive decks, like things like Jund, like the 80 card Yorion decks are just not where I want to be positionally in the format. Advanced Snow. And with the Lotus Box thing coming up, plus just wanting to explore like Modern with companions, I tried playing like Modern with companions. I tried playing like Lurrus Jund, the Lurrus Field Jund deck, which is a weird one, and like Yorion Urza, and just kind of playing those decks and trying to check my biases kind of at the door and be like, okay, yes, like it's probably better to be proactive a lot of the time, threat speed answers, but Magic's so different right now, especially Modern. I should definitely see like, does always having access to alerts change things, because it definitely did for aggro decks. Like I played a lot of human Lurrus and found that to be quite powerful. So that was my always improving moment of the week. Gotta stretch out sometimes and make sure we're not living in a bubble too much.
Always a fan of Jund, so you sold me. Jund.
Have you played much? I know that you've been streaming Jund a little bit since you got back, but have you played much of the Jund Lurrus decks?
Yeah, I've played a handful of it. I've been trying to. Something like happened with MTG Goldfish where I think they like got rid of Jund as a category because now it's just like Lurrus Jund. But I'm trying to find Jund lists that are just typical Jund playing Lurrus in the deck, because I think that is kind of what I'm missing with the deck, I suppose.
Sure.
Sure, like companions are powerful, but I think like I'm getting to the point where like the matches that I am losing with Jund, it's definitely the matches that I suffer without Bloodbraid Elf or without Liliana of the Veil.
Yeah, that's true. Like we saw Boggles crush the what's it called, the PTQ this past weekend. Liliana of the Veil is running around. That's a lot less likely to happen even with Lurrus. Although I guess Lurrus does give you Liliana fodder always, which is kind of funny. I had not considered that until we started talking right now. Yeah.
So I mean, like I might just play Burn this weekend, honestly.
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards the.
I mean, like I might just play Burn this weekend, honestly.
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards the Ryan Overturf's prowess Burn deck or whatever. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's really weird. I think the games are actually, not to go off too far on tangent here, but I actually think the games are super fun with the Lurrus stuff. But it's very, very different Magic than what even I think was happening in the Jund decks before. And they're also all so much more efficient on mana and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, I feel like my Jund opponents never have clunky draws, where like sometimes you mulligan and you have 2 Bloodbraid Elves in your hand and you just don't quite have something to do on turn 3, And now they're like, my whole deck's 2 CMC or less, I'm always popping off. So yeah, it's an interesting experience. All right, so now it's time for our Patreon question. If you want to support this show, you go to patreon.com/ccmtg and help support the show. And you get to ask a question like Adrian did this week. Adrian's question is, what do you look for when you're combing through tournament results? Are you looking for a spicy new list to come out of nowhere? So, we kind of mentioned it a second ago with Jund, but Allie, do you want to take it away here?
I think this is a really good question, like specifically for our podcast too, because I know we've talked about wanting to kind of like look over tournament results for a lot of our episodes and kind of just explore formats and stuff. So I really like this question, and I think as with a lot of questions in life, unfortunately, the answer is it depends. I think for me, if I'm looking at something like standard, I'm actually like more interested in just seeing like new decks and maybe any like spicy deck lists. Mostly like in general, I do like looking at bigger tournaments as opposed to like Moto League 5-0s and stuff. But yeah, like sometimes you can like benefit. Yeah, like sometimes you can like benefit from that, I suppose. It kind of just like is whatever works for you, I feel like.
Yeah, it also kind of depends on like why I'm looking for stuff. Like, let's say I'm looking because I'm going to an SCG in a week, right? And I have like the week off between things and I'm trying to explore stuff. At the start of the first of the 2 weeks, I might just be looking for stuff that seems more interesting and kind of something that we haven't seen before and looking for potential. And a lot of times when you look through that kind of stuff, you're not going to find anything too special, but sometimes you do stumble across something that's like, oh, wait, this like Niv Mizzet deck looks kind of great. It's like just playing a bunch of removal and using Niv Mizzet to close the game. Maybe that's something, And then like leading into maybe the week of the event, we're getting closer, I might be looking for more like minutia type stuff. Like, okay, I'm really going to play Wurza, right? I'm going to play the Wurza deck, and I'm just kind of looking for sideboard stuff and seeing how people are planning to approach and like I get tinkered with. Like a lot of times the core like 55 cards in the main deck are really established a lot, and so I'm looking for those extra 5 slots. And I'm also keeping my eye open for somebody making a big pivot, and does that pivot make sense? I'm not, when I'm looking for them, I'm not looking just to change just for the sake of changing, but I'm really looking for changing for the sake of this makes sense,
I'm really glad you brought that point up too. I think when I'm unsure of what I'm going to play, I'm more likely to look at like big tournaments, like what's winning, what's doing well, what am I going to play against this week, just based on like what's been doing well, what do I think people are going to bring. But then after I do decide a deck, like say in this like Lotus Box tournament, I'm going to play Luris Jund. Then instead of looking at like some of the bigger tournaments, I might start looking at the like most recent 5-0s on Moto just to find those like last couple of sideboard pieces. Seeing the newest thing that people are doing and trying, and then try that out myself.
Yeah, and I think another thing that this does that's very important is like it gives you an idea of what other people are doing too, right? So let's say like, you know, me and Allie are both looking for Luris Jund decks, and we're seeing they're all playing Grimflayer now, right? It's like, okay, maybe we don't agree with that Grimflayer choice, but then we're playing a game and we see our opponent has a weird card like, I don't know, like a Trial of Ambition, right? Or something like that. It's like, oh, they probably have Grimflayer in the deck. And now we have more information. And even more importantly, I think, you get to look at the other decks and see how they're sideboarding, and that's a big thing I look over. When I'm looking over deck lists before a tournament and I'm like working on a sideboard guide or working on building my sideboard, I look at other decks I think are popular and I look at what cards they're playing, right? So like if I'm playing a Luris Jund deck, maybe people's plan is to attack my graveyard, right? It's going to make my Luris bad. It's going to make my Tarmogoyfs worse. That's the thing that maybe, you know, I'm checking out. So maybe I'll try to look for a sideboard card if I see everyone doing that kind of thing that can maybe interact with that if I feel that's an axis I want to fight on. So that's an example of something else I'm looking at with deck lists is, okay, yes, my bubble really matters, but it also really matters what the rest of the world's doing, right? I can't just ignore these other decks. They all have plans. So that's it for me.
Agree.
That's it for that. It's hard though, right? Like looking over all these deck lists and like trying to come to conclusions. And also you kind of, you know, I'm not going to lie and say I spend hours looking over deck lists or anything like that. You know, like a lot of time you're doing a lot of like skimming or like control Fing, you know, and it can be hard to stay on top of everything. So I think it's definitely something that it is kind of like a test, right, Allie? Like if you skip the test and you get a 0, and the average on your test grades go down a lot, right? But if you go there and you put in like 70 or 80, maybe it wasn't the best in the world, but at least it helps towards that, right? And it becomes easier too, you know, you get some practice. So
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, Adrian, for that. If you want to support the show once again, you go to patreon.com/ccmtg, where you can go to our sponsor, Oasis Games. You can go to Oasis Games. They have all the cards you're looking for. They're going to have everything ready to ship out for Ikoria. I believe, yeah, it is this Friday Ikoria drops. So you can go there right now, get your cards pre-ordered, and they'll get to you very quickly. Normally, like if I had a real life tournament, I order my cards like today, and they get here by Thursday. And, you know, that's not like getting overnight ship or anything. That's just they're on top of it and they, you know, send out very quickly. So go to Oasis Games, use code CCMTG for 4% off every order, and in code Would That Be Good for 15% off your first order. That way they know we sent you. Allie, are you excited to talk about this main topic? Because this is like your kind of brainchild. So I'd love to hear about what you think about revisiting old decks and ideas.
I'm actually really excited you wanted to talk about this week because I'm starting to like formulate and write an article about it as well. And yeah, it's just like something that I think a lot of people don't think about or even talk about in any capacity is the idea of revisiting these old decks, or different like strategies, archetypes, after kind of like a format is maybe not like solved, but is so far away from that one deck that like it's just like not a consideration anymore. And I ended up thinking about this for the first time actually when it was like the end of the last standard, so right before Ikoria released. I started playing Jund Sacrifice on the ladder and just like couldn't lose with it because the best deck at the time was Bant Ramp. That's all I played against, and I like sprung from like the bottom of gold to like diamond just like with this deck. I'm like, what is going on? This like isn't a deck anymore.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think it's important to do this thing and check it, right? And it's kind of like what we alluded to earlier in the show when talking about like looking over deck lists. And we're not looking for these old things just to be different, but checking them out to see what's there before could become really powerful in the current metagame because things change, right? Like the reason that maybe Jund Food wasn't so good before at the start of the format is because Team of Reclamation and some other decks were around, and that made it really hard to play Jund Food, right? And then when those decks leave the format, if you're not looking back and being like, wait, why did we stop playing that like insane Jund deck that like dominated a format before and got some new cards? It's like, oh, well, you can't play that because of Wilderness Reclamation. It's like, wait, who's playing Wilderness Reclamation? You know? And so trying to checking those biases is so important. And I heard a story from a friend about another game that was just like this. I thought was great to incorporate into this. So I haven't played much Counter-Strike, but I started playing Valorant. And my friend Michael Hinderocker, he was telling me about Valorant. And my friend Michael Hinderocker, he was telling me about how in Counter-Strike they hadn't had a patch in a really long time, right? And there was kind of this established meta alley where you all like you bought this kind of gun, did this kind of thing, and then one streamer decided I'm going to start playing with the AUG, and they found out that this gun, the AUG, was like actually insane on all metrics, and it totally changed everything. But people had decided you couldn't play the AUG because of this other gun that was happening, right? And so it's just a perfect example in the metagame. It's like, wait, why are we establishing these rules on ourselves that aren't there, right? We do this thing as Magic players where we impose rules that aren't real, and then we decide that because these rules have happened or these things have happened, we can't go back and check things because, oh, we've already established this thing happens.
Yeah, I think it's like super pronounced in the past couple standards too. Like these, like a new deck appears and then it's suddenly just like the format then incorporates this new deck, then incorporates this new deck plus like Bant Ramp and Jeskai Fires, and that's like the format. That's the established format until some of these other decks like fall off and they just like end up being forgotten about. Like to some extent these decks never like really pop back, and standard feels like pretty like cyclical and changes a lot based on who's presenting a new deck, like what weird wacky combo with Agent of Treachery did people find. And yeah, so I mean like with this standard, Nick Prince just wrote an article about Golgari Adventures, mostly like the same list that I played in MC7 and just like updated with new cards, and I started playing it on stream today, and like I was Treachery decks. So
yeah,
it's just kind of like at what point do you, I don't know, like try and just bring back a different deck that is just completely fallen out of the meta for like months.
Yeah, it's really hard to know when too, and I definitely had moments before where I'm like, wait, what did that like mono white deck that Canister played at it like an MC look like, right, or whatever? You know, I'm just like, wait, wouldn't that be really good right now? And you go and you look up the old deck list, you know, and you can like try to port it to standard, and sometimes those things they lead to big results, even if it's just like, okay, the deck's like finely positioned in the format. People not having sideboard plans for you and not having cards that matter is a huge step up, especially if you have cards that matter, right? Like if you're playing a mono white aggressive deck and your deck has like 4 Hushbringers, right? Well, then the Agent of Treachery decks might not be, you know, prepared. How have you found like the time to go back and look at these things? Are you looking for like stale meta games when a deck isn't like vibing with you? Like what is the kind of the things that set off in your head to look backwards, like the alarms? Because I do think sometimes, you know, you don't want to default to always looking back, right? So how do you like move forward with it?
Yeah, I think the first time actually happened completely on accident. Like what was it? Like Bant made its breakout as the best deck after the after the Magic Fest Online that Andrei Strosky won with Bant, and I also top 8'd that one with Rakdos Sacrifice. So immediately after that, like I could not win anything with Rakdos Sacrifice. That one with Rakdos Sacrifice. So immediately after that, like I could not win anything with Rakdos Sacrifice because just like Bant had completely tailored their entire plan to beating Rakdos Sacrifice because it was kind of the only other deck really. And I was just like, at a loss of like, well, how can I do this and beat Bant? And then just, yeah, for some reason, I'm like, well, it gets to a point where we just like run out of things to do. We run out of card advantage and can't kind of come back after a board wipe. So I was like, okay, well, what happens? Like, whatever happened to like Jund? Like, Jund had a lot of card advantage, like Trail of Crumbs, Corvold, just like a Gilded Goose, a bunch of stuff like that. And so I'm like, all right, like, new cards as well that are like just like tune it, try and make it beat Bant, and it did.
Yeah, it is crazy though, right? How, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think it's almost like a, for lack of a better term, like laziness, right? Like, I go to my like Twitter or I listen to my podcast, and like we at the time too, you mentioned Jund, I think the week of, or maybe the week after the last MFO for that format, or the last week of that format. But like, people say like, oh, I'm supposed to play these decks, I'm supposed to do these things. What kind of stops people from going back in your mind? Because in my mind, it seems like it's kind of the same thing with sideboard guides, right? It's like, all right, like, I like to play humans, so I'm going to subscribe to Dylan Hand's Patreon because, he's going to put a lot of work in on humans, and I just don't have the time right now to explore this kind of stuff. Do you think it's kind of like that, or what do you think it is? Do you think it's like we've decided this, so this is the way things are now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a mix of a lot of things, like what you were saying, as well as like when you start seeing decks fall out of favor, so you're just like not seeing the results anymore. So why would someone want to go back and play a deck that hasn't had any good finishes for months, like even to try it, when you can just play whatever the new fun flashy deck that Croaky's just brewed or something?
Yeah, I was going to mention Croaky's. I'm glad you mentioned him. Yeah, it seems like he comes in and he makes declarative statements, right? Like, this is the best deck. And he plays enough, and we've all kind of just trusted Croaky's, right? We've all just decided that that's the thing we're going to do. And he also approaches deck building in such like a weird way that like catches our eyes a lot of the time. Like Arena Decklist, that Croaky's was building decks way better than they had been doing it for like the last 3 months. It's because he has like this different approach. So if you want to hear more about that, go check them out. Their podcast is great. But either way, like, that is, I think, a very interesting thing you mentioned. Do you think that like, I hate to use the term influencer, but do you think like influencers, like, I think they have a huge stand in the meta, and I'm just going to not try and lead you. I'm just going to make my statement. I think people like Croaky's, when they tweet out deck lists, it affects ladder and things like that drastically. And I expect like the same thing, like if VTCLA Baker tweets a deck list, I expect standard MTGO leagues to like have that deck a lot. Do you think that's like a real thing, or do you think that's maybe me just having biases?
No, I think that's completely true. I mean, there's literally decks that did not exist before, like Croaky's would stream it or put it on Twitter or whatever. Along with that, even if you're not into more of the like new like brewing kind of like decks, you still just like look at the Magic Fest online. Like you see like Brad Nelson and Seth Manfield and Gabe Nassif and just like literally like all these professional Magic players continuing to play the same decks every week, or like the same like 2 or 3 decks every week. And so like you're seeing these players that are just like great players. You're like, oh, well, like if they're doing that, that has to be correct. So if they're not going back and exploring different strategies or stuff, like why should I, or whatever?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So so we kind of talked about like why these things happen. Let's try to identify the times when we should be going forward and going about doing this, and like the process of actually doing it. And so we used your Bant example earlier to kind of frame it, but let's kind of look at right now, right, and see if maybe now's the time to move forward with things and use the current kind of frame it. But let's kind of look at right now, right, and see if maybe now's the time to move forward with things and use the current standard as an example. So current standard, right, is kind of like, we got Luca decks. Well, we have a bunch of Agent Treachery decks, really. All the decks are like trying to build towards Agent Treachery, but you have like Luca to do it. You have like Bant trying to do it, and then you have like, fires as an enabler for some of those decks, right? And then you have I don't think there are any other real decks right now, right? There's the Reclamation deck and the Cycling deck. So our kind of our pillars of the format are Agent decks, Cycling decks, and these Team Reclamation decks. So when we think about those things, Allie, what kind of jumps to your mind right away as like maybe something to do? Like what's like an older deck? Is there anything coming to you or?
So, I mean, my first thought thinking of this current standard, which I'd written an article about last week, was like, well, I really want to beat Yorion / Agent of Treachery decks, and how do we beat those decks? And I ended up going in like directions of pretty much established decks already. But then, I mean, like Nick Prince, kind of like took the same idea and went in a different direction of exploring an old deck, which was Golgari Adventures, of just like identifying how good, say, like Casualties of War is against these decks and how good ramping that out is. So
yeah, so you kind of identified, you're good. So you kind of like identified like, okay, all these decks are doing things that Casualties of War are really strong against, right? Like they're all trying to put a lot of mana in. Maybe they're trying to stick like a permanent or two. I'm sorry, a creature permanent or two, and they all have like an enchantment, right? Like every one of those decks has an enchantment, and then even some of the fringier decks all have artifacts, right? Like won the GP this last weekend, but like so that deck has like a couple little things that can blow up, and so Nick kind of identified like, okay, everyone's trying to do the same thing. What can I do that interacts with all of those things? And what is like a positive thing to do that, right? And you think of the card Casualties of War, it's like, okay, Casualties blows up all these things. They need their mana to set back, or they're going to be set so far back, right? That's actually one of the most punched things about Agent Treachery, is when you get your first one out, is you set them back on mana if they don't have like some insane spell. And it's like, okay, so I want to do that. Then I also want to be aggressive because I need to put a clock on all of these decks, right? So green-black starting to look like the type of thing that's like, okay, and I also want to try and avoid Elspeth Conquers Death, because that's a card that's like really impactful and a catch-up mechanic for a lot of these decks, where I want to make sure that like I punish the fact that they're not getting on board for Zenith Flare or Temur Wreck. And so I think Nick did like a really great job of identifying like, okay, this is kind of like the perfect storm to bring back this deck that, you know, we saw have a spike in popularity at, that was the MC you were at, correct?
Yeah.
All right, MC. Yeah, so we had MC7. You know, we saw Allie Warfield top 16 with it. We saw Autumn playing it. We saw someone else playing it too. Sorry for the other person. And, you know, then the deck, some stuff happened and changed. But now it's kind of like the time again. And I think that deck really should be getting explored, because I saw Nick post that thing and I played it and I was like, wow, this seems really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. Even like you mentioned, just like the Magic Fest Online, the Temur Clover deck, like, sure, that was like a popular deck last standard, but for this standard, like, I really haven't seen any of it. So like that kind of takes our idea too of like that deck had fallen out of favor, and someone had identified that just kind of like these synergies around Lucky Clover, or even like card advantage, playing a lot of creatures, like all of that culminating together is pretty good against Agent of Treachery.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we all agreed that if we're doing one really big thing a turn, Agent of Treachery is going to win, right? But the Lucky Clover deck, like you just mentioned, is like, okay, but I'm going to do like 4 pretty big things. Like I'm going to make a bunch of these things, or stomp a bunch of your stuff, run some of a bunch of things, or Fey Wishes for like a couple cards. Like I'm going to make a bunch of these things, or stomp a bunch of your stuff, run some of a bunch of things, or Fey Wishes for like a couple cards. And I'm going to like make this game matter in a different way. And I think that's like you just said, is another great example of that. I'm kind of thinking right now, and we've seen this actually happen a little bit this week, so it's a little disingenuous, but the mono red decks of old, like the one Seth Manfield played at Worlds, are also really good against these kind of decks, right? And we've seen the Obosh red deck that's just like 16 1-drops, some shocks, annexes, Phoenix, and light up the stage in Obosh, and that's the deck, and I'm just going to attack you. And that's like another great example, right? Of like, okay, if we all agree that the format's about making big plays and stopping them with Agent of Treachery, I'm going to make a bunch of small plays, right? And I hope what this is kind of helping the listeners when they're hearing this is not so much like, okay, this is like what's happening now, I should like copy what they're saying. It's explaining kind of the thought process behind it, right? And I think that's the part that gets lost in communication a lot of times when it comes to content. So
Yeah, I mean, it's like a really hard topic to like think about or even talk about, because it's like, well, when are we going to do this? When is this a good or bad idea? How do we even do this? And how do we even like talk about this to describe this as a concept in general?
yeah, it really is hard though, right? Like even when I was like outlining the show, it's kind of hard to talk about this without using an example of like a current format, right? Or coming up with hypotheticals, and then honestly just talking through the process and kind of hoping that listeners can apply that sort of thought process to their own games and into future environments, right? You could try to do something like that with modern and other formats too, but basically the just playing on and then trying to, like, for lack of a better term, like knock those points off, right? Like try to do something totally just different.
I definitely think utilizing like this technique or just like revisiting old decks is generally really good when we're looking at formats with smaller formats with like less decks.
Yeah.
So like at the end of last standard, it was literally you play Rakdos Sacrifice, you play Just Skyfires, or you play Bant Ramp, and that was kind of it. If the standard gets to the point where it's like everyone is literally only playing like Bant, Yorion, and a Luca deck, which like it feels like maybe it's almost there. Then maybe it's time to a Luca deck, which like it feels like maybe it's almost there. Then maybe it's time to actually like do this and look at these other decks. But like some of the liabilities of that, if you're trying to do this in like a bigger format, is these decks kind of got pushed out for a reason, and you're more likely to play against a deck that pushed your deck out of the format if the format is like bigger. So that a consideration there.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Like the bigger the format gets, and the kind of like the you kind of hit it there on the head there. Like, okay, you kind of can only do what we're talking about once a format starts to like congeal and slow down, right? Like you can't do this like day one of standard, right? Like, okay, everyone's playing this weird cycling deck with the big red enchantment. I should go back to this thing, right? There's just too much going on. But once people all start of, for lack of a better term, kind of get in line and agree with what's going on, then it's much easier to just want to play Boggles. And that's the deck they're going to play, and they want to tinker with Boggles, and that's totally fine, but it makes it a lot harder to like attack a modern metagame when some people are like, listen, I'm only showing up with Boggles or Karn Liberated. That's it. That's my life. I love doing it. Can't stop me. And it's like, okay, well, none of these decks I built will ever beat either of those decks, so I'm in trouble. But
yeah, I definitely think this is the hardest thing to do in modern, because I mean the people's format, people are going to play literally whatever they want, which like you might think they might do this in like Legacy too, and like to some extent that exists, but like I don't know, Legacy and Modern are so different to me, where like I feel like a lot of the time in Legacy you can actually metagame, because even if people do play like their pet decks or whatever, like it still kind of falls within an actual like archetype theme metagame, etc. Whereas like Modern, they like their pet decks or whatever, like it still kind of falls within an actual like archetype theme metagame, etc. Whereas like Modern, you can play anything from Boggles to Mill to Valakut to Tron, and it's just like nothing is ever the same. And even in like Hogak Summer, I still played against people not playing Hogak. So
have I told you my experience in Hogak Summer? I think I've told this on the podcast once before, but basically I played 4 major events. I played like 3 SCGs and a GP in a 5-week period, and I played against Hogak 4 times. I'm sorry, it was 3 times. One of those times was before the tournament, so I'm sorry to forget it. But well, actually, one of them was Nick Prince, and he was the only person I played at GP Vegas playing Hogak. And it was like, wait, we all know like this deck's broken. What are we doing? And it was just this wild experience. And it's this thing too where sometimes people, like SCG Philly, everyone was like, Arclight Phoenix beats this Hogak deck. Like, it's not actually a problem. And then you saw, like, a lot of SCG grinders playing Arclight Phoenix. My team played 2 Arclight Phoenixes. We saw, like, the team Amulet playing triple Phoenix as their team. There was just a bunch of Arclight. And people just decide, like, nah, this isn't a thing. So everyone really has to be on the same page to do what we're talking about, where otherwise this plan just doesn't work, And so I wonder if it's even possible to do it in Pioneer, It feels like it's almost too open as well, right? Like, Legacy has this weird thing where it has, like, restricting points on the format, like Daze, Daze, Force of Will, Chalice of the Void. Those kind of things are going to make it so you can't actually do too many crazy things, along with combo decks that are really insane. And so it's like, all right, well, we kind of are actually limited in our card pool, but Modern doesn't have those same restrictions, and Pioneer definitely doesn't have those outside of Inverter or Breach. So it's like, it becomes really hard to actually do this in those formats. In a weird way, Legacy is like the second smallest card pool. So, yeah, it's kind of wild to think about.
I will say that I do think if it is possible in Modern, it would probably be along the lines of right now. Like, I think everyone is pretty much playing a Luris deck or something similar. And, I mean, like, we saw it in the PTQ this last week of Boggles winning, and I think that is, like, obviously there are some people who just love Boggles and are going to play it anyway, but if you're specifically, like, going back and looking at Modern results and you're seeing, like, oh, like, it's just like a ton of, like, Luris Jund or Death Shadow, Spurn, like, you can go back and look, which deck can capitalize on these 2 decks being probably the majority of what I'm going to play in this tournament.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the person, I saw their tweet, they basically said, like, it looked like this was the weekend to play Boggles, and so they chose it and they rewarded, right? And these kind of things they really do lead to huge rewards, and that's why it's so important to talk about, like, exploring this already explored territory and just double checking our work, kind of. But there is something that I think is important for us to talk about that we'd be disingenuous to not talk about, and we've alluded to a little bit, and that's knowing when to give up and not kind of dying on this creative hill, right? There are going to just be times where there might not be the tools, unfortunately, or there might be too many different choke points in the format that make it so your tools aren't really doable. And you need to know, like, okay, Mason Alley told me that I'm supposed to look back at these things, and there just might not be something there to answer it. I would say this is especially true in higher power small formats. So, like, Legacy is a great example, right? What we talk about, like, in Legacy, you could probably do this, but because the cards are so powerful, you're going to need to be doing something very similar or also incredibly powerful along these lines in order to actually make a real dent in the format. And so there's definitely this love. I mean, I don't know about you, but, sometimes it's not fun just to play the mirrors over and over and over again. Maybe a particular mirror isn't fun, and, you want to do something different, but we need to know not to die on this hill, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's a ton of old decks that, like, you can always, like, go back and explore. I'm thinking kind of just, like, in the frame of Standard right now, because I think this topic resonates with Standard the best. And I mean, like, even if we're looking at, like, last format where I identified that, like, Jund Sacrifice was actually, like, really good, there was still, like, a ton of decks that I could have done the same thing to. Like, maybe I, like, thought about it and I was like, what's, like, really good is that old Is It Flash deck, and I try that out and I'm just, like, not winning. It's not getting there. Maybe, like theoretically it makes sense to me, but that's just, like, not how it's playing out. Like, it's okay to just kind of, like, not, like, give up really, but just, like, accept the realities of the format, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's giving up implies that, like, this is the only way to do things, right? It's just kind of like, okay, this is just a thing that doesn't work right now, and that's okay. We did the work, kind of.
Also, like, if you have the ability to, like, I know, like, sometimes, like, decks sometimes don't really click with me, or I don't know how to play a deck like 100%. So I actually like gave the Jund list to a handful of other people too, of just like, hey, like I think this deck conceptually is really good in the format right now. And it got like 3 people to Mythic. I'm like, all right, I feel a little better now that like I was probably like correct about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's huge. Well, Ali, is there anything else you want to say on this before we wrap up here?
Mm. I think in general, like Arena makes this whole concept pretty easy to do because I don't know. Like if you have a pretty stocked arena account, you can kind of just like flip back to like old decks you've had anyway. So,
Yeah, I think that's actually. Ali, do you delete all of your decks or do you keep them?
I have been deleting them just to like free up space. I do like every time a new set comes out, but like I'm kind of thinking like maybe I shouldn't just maybe like keep like 1 or 2 of the old decks. Like maybe this can like stick around for a little bit.
Yeah, I used to definitely do that thing where I just deleted all of them, but I got kind of lazy in the last one. I didn't, and a couple of times now I've been like, wait, like wasn't that Rakdos Sacrifice deck really good and like kind of fast and aggressive? And so like I took that and just changed some cards, worked a companion in. You know, it's just Giganta, nothing crazy, but it's like okay, I had that kind of shell and it's an easy point of reference, and it's like right there, just like you talked about, right? Like it's like click, click, click. All right, let's play. You know, let's try this thing out, and also everyone's working kind of towards the same goal of like having a chance to qualify towards the PT, so they have some incentive to actually play well, and jump in there and see what it's like and get the experience. So, yeah, I think that's huge. So, all right, well, if you want to find us, you can go to twitch.tv/the Mason Clark to find my Twitch, and you can go to Mason E. Clark on twitter.com. Ali, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
You can find me on the website, otherwise known as twitter.com, and find me at Mythic Meebo, or you can watch my stream at twitch.tv/mythic_Meebo.
Ali, you mentioned you wrote articles. If someone wants to see the companion piece sort of this, to see the article version, where could they go to see that?
Yeah, I write for TCG Player, so you can hop on over there and find a handful of articles I've already written, and my articles come out on Saturday, so keep your eyes peeled.
Awesome. Well, until next week.